It's so good to see you all. I'm glad that you are here. I believe we have 20 persons on this. Some are going to be Zoom, some are going to be in person, and we are going to talk about racism for a few weeks. I've chosen this book because I believe it is a compassionate approach to a very difficult subject. And I pray that our time together, anytime we talk about heavy lightning rod topics, right, or things that become taboo or whatever, however you want to describe them, it breeds anxiety. And we want to get, we lost Diane. We want to get to a point where we are lessening anxiety so that we can have meaningful conversations. And that's what I'm hoping to accomplish here. Now, let us begin with a prayer. Almighty God, we give you thanks for the beauty of this day. We thank you that you love us and that you are with us. We pray that you would give us a spirit of peace and comfort and guide us in our discussions. In the name of Christ, we pray. Amen. On the first page there, on page 2, I should say, there's these points that are commitments of presence. And I have been using these in personal life for probably 5 years. And so it's the first time I've introduced it into this community. And I want us to kind of I want to introduce it now as a way of us on the threshold of beginning conversations that can cause anxiety or that can be tough, right? And here, I will not read the descriptions, but what I would have you do is to read them and reflect on them this week, and we will review. We'll go through the commitments of presence at the beginning of each of our classes together. The first one, be fully present. The second one, listen generously. The idea of waiting until someone is fully finished their thoughts so that we can give them all of our attention. We come as equals. No person's gifts, limits, or experiences are any more or less important than another's. It is never share or die, right? So if you do not feel like sharing, that is okay. No fixing. We are not here to fix. There's only one fixer that I've ever known of, and I am not going to try and presume that I am he. That's Jesus, in case you didn't know. Suspend judgment. Part of what we want to do is to suspend some of our judgment and begin thinking and shaping our brains to welcome new information and to suspend judgment. Turn to wonder. If you find yourself becoming judgmental or cynical, try turning to wonder. I wonder what my reaction teaches me. I wonder what they are feeling right now. Turn to wonder. Practice confidentiality care. Now, to be fair, we are recording this and we'll put this on the YouTube. And so, I would say that the confidence is whatever you choose it to be, but whatever we choose to share with each other will be in the spirit of trust within the community that we are building together. And welcome discomfort and dislocation. Oftentimes we find ourselves in discomfort or being dislocated. We get to ask ourselves, those are insights into, those are clues into something that we are trying to uncover. So if I find myself in a conversation with John and he's saying something that makes me begin to feel a little uncomfortable, that is an indicator, that is a clue that I should investigate. Why am I feeling a little uncomfortable? What is it that, for lack of a better word, that he's saying that is beginning to trigger me? And what is that sense of being triggered, or whatever that may be, that discomfort, beginning to reveal to me to understand more about myself. And then finally, love the questions themselves. Let your questions linger. Release the compulsion to answer them or to have them answered. And we're going to talk about that a good bit. Some of these a little bit more fleshed out today. But sometimes it's the questions themselves that also give us shape and shape our world and shape our perspectives, and also begin to reform our perspectives. Any questions on these? Elaine, did you find it? She can't find it? Okay, well, we'll make sure you get it. Okay, we'll make sure you get it later. Any questions on these? We're going to try to review them at the beginning of each class so that we can stay in community together, okay? Oh, good. Phoenix, would you let that Gloria in? Go to up to the very top where it says admit. Thank you. All right, so let's talk about anxious to talk about it, okay? Carolyn Helsel, the author of this book, and this is a book study, so I do want to encourage you to buy it and read the chapters along with us as we go through the class. This is the second edition. I myself have the first edition, and the only thing that's missing is chapter 2 in the second edition, which is how did we get here? That she added a second chapter. So, and there's a little bit extra stuff and some smaller stuff in some of the other chapters, but let's try to base out of the second edition, and I'll do my best to do that as well. And what I'm hoping for is that we have opportunity more for dialogue than for me yapping my head off and y'all just listening. So my prayer and hope for us in this class is that as we're going through it, there's maybe some new insights that are coming to you, or there's beginning the formation of questions about racism or movements in the world that begin to trigger us to say, you know what, that needs a little bit more research in my life, or I trust this group of folks. Can I ask this question? And us to begin talking about it. Okay. So in the introduction of the book, she talks about white and anxious, and there's a few things that I have offered to you. If you look at white and anxious DA, what are the sources of your anxiety as you think about race? What are the memories that this subject bring up for you? Now, I've created an online form, and there it is, hopeaustin.org/anxious. And that question is there for you if you like. You may answer the question there confidentially. You do not have to give your name or anything. Just simply, if you want to take a moment sometime this week and answer the question, what are the sources of your anxiety as you think about race? What are the memories about this subject? What are the memories that this subject brings up for you? And you can write as much or as little as you want. It will not be shared. It is an opportunity for you to say something out loud with only your pastor to read it, okay, and to not share it. And you don't even have to give your name. So if Cricket wants to, if you want to write and just say everything and just spill your guts and put it all out there and not give me your name, that is absolutely what I created this for. You're also welcome to put your name also if you will, but if you want to, but it is not a requirement. And so what I hope that tool helps you is to being able to say something out loud that many of us have never said out loud before. Whether those are questions, whether those are frustrations, whether those are affirmations, whatever that may be, that's what I've created that for you, all right, to put something on paper. A couple of things that she says is that everyone can learn how to talk about race, to stay in the conversation long enough so that when the opportunity for you to act comes, you will know what to do. And she also adds, if your own anxiety is too great when someone shares with you about the experience of racial discrimination, You may be tempted to defend rather than just listen. Also, white people, you and me, and she knows her audience, need to be responsible for our own learning and education about this subject that we've been able to avoid most of our lives. Let's hope that the markers work today. All right. Yes. Yay. Oh, close enough. So on a scale of things, when we are, I know, I don't think that this one works any better. Oh, maybe it does. Thank you, Phoenix. Phoenix, put it on our to-do list, dry erase markers.
Okay, where's that?
It's right here.
Oh.
What can happen when we are talking about difficult subjects, particularly race and racism? What can happen on one end? We can be polarized. And we start to move towards being defensive. And all the other way in, we look at adaptive and acceptance. And this is right here in the middle of the road. Okay. And this is M for minimalization. Wow, I've never done that before. Okay. Hopefully y'all can see that. On one end of the scale, there we go. Look at this Spielberg up in here. On one end of the scale, when we are so guarded, when we are so set into talking about a subject or so defensive of a subject or so upset by a subject, we end up being polarizing, which is I'm right, you're wrong, you're on that other end of the scale, and I'm on the right side of the scale. We begin polarizing one against another. And you may see examples of this out in society, just watching the news, depending on the news channel, either news channel, any of the news channels, you can see evidence of polarization. As we begin to do some more work and begin to gain some more confidence in having discussion, we may move from polarizing to being defensive. Okay. Well, all right. So this is like an actively us versus them. This is me beginning to say, you know what? I think that I'm right and I need to defend my argument, right? When we get to minimalization, which is here in the middle, what we can have tendency to do is to minimalize the thoughts and experiences of others. Now, we may be working our way down the scale, right? And we may find ourselves, we may say, you know what, I support the NAACP, or I support the Black Lives Matter movement, or this, that, and the other, but in inadvertent ways, we can still end up being minimalized, being one who can minimize the experiences of others. Minimalizing is saying that all persons of a certain race experiences is the same, right? We just minimalize it. Right here in minimalization, we may also be at the point of saying something to the effect of we're all equal in God's eyes. We're minimalizing the topic of racism and the topic and experiences of others, right? The experience that Phoenix has in middle school, if I were to just as his father say, you know what, he'll get over it. Everybody pays their dues in middle school, right? I'm minimalizing his experience. Now I acknowledge that it can be hard and it can be frustrating, but I'm saying get used to it or pay your dues. And that's this kind of a minimalization here. Beginning to move towards acceptance and the overall idea of adaptive. Acceptance will be, I can accept that the experiences are all different. I can accept that though I had troubles in middle school as well, that his experience, he is not me. He doesn't have the same family background. He doesn't have the same historical context in which he's living. His experience that he is living out, I accept as his own, and therefore I begin to validate it. Does that make sense? And then moving towards adaptive, let me just think, Lloyd. Then moving towards adaptive, which is not only do I accept it, But then I also began to work with him and how we might adapt towards solutions together to have a successful middle school experience, or in the context of race, how we begin to not only accept the differences among us, but begin to adapt our community and our relationships in a way that allows those ideas to thrive, those differences to not separate us, but to thrive, and that we begin to celebrate. Gloria? Oh, I thought you were just waving. Okay, I thought you were just waving at me. And I think this is the point that that Helsel is getting to with when we become overwhelmed with our anxiety, we begin to get more defensive or polarized, and in doing so, we can get stagnant, right? We begin to see things only through one lens or one perspective. So chapter 1 that she's getting into here is the way in which we think about race. And she begins naming things, begins to put names to things such as the melting pot, reverse racism, post-racial, colorblind. In the second edition of the book, she adds to it white supremacy and white privilege. These are all terms that we can loft out there that I think accomplishes a lot of this work, from minimalization all the way to polarization, right? Sometimes when we hear the word white privilege, it can make us feel so polarized. When we hear the term melting pot, that might be some aspect of where the idea of melting pot in America implies that all ethnic differences among immigrants have melted into one citizenry. We begin minimalizing in that perspective there. Does that make sense? So she's naming some of these terms that we're familiar with and the way in which they have an impact on us, and how limiting they can be for our conversation and dialogue with each other. Have y'all experienced these vocabulary before? What kind of thoughts do you have with regard to vocabulary that we use, or the impact that they trigger on you emotionally? Like when you hear melting pot, what is it that your mind or heart is thinking?
Elementary school social science.
Okay.
Learning about the 1800, 1900 immigration, mostly from Europe. Everybody came together, it was a melting pot.
Okay, yeah, Emily.
John, the same thing. When I first was teaching, the term we used in social studies was the melting pot. As my teaching career progressed, it changed to the salad bowl, where you identified the identities that were still there together, not as one. That bothered me a lot at first, because I like the idea that we're one people. However, since COVID, it's made me realize we're all in different boats. It's the same storm, but we're all in different boats. And now I find that the idea of the salad bowl is much more important. And I wish I had realized that when I was still teaching.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard the salad bowl. And there's some idea that makes sense. I'm thinking Cobb salad, right? You got a little bit of blue cheese, right? It's not a Cobb salad without the blue cheese, right? I'm thinking of,
There may be differences, social studies curriculum north versus social
absolutely,
studies curriculum south.
absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother day. John.
I just remember growing up the same way. I grew up in New Jersey, and we always talked about New York is the melting pot of the world. And it's like, and just like what John was saying, it's because of a lot of immigrants, and that was the melting pot. So I guess my question is that been replaced with the word diversity?
I don't think so. I think especially if you were to really look at New York City, of which I've never lived there, but I think even if you were to look at New York City, what is it that you really see? Do you really see a melting pot, or do you see multiple boroughs, multiple areas where people of different ethnicity congregate? You have Harlem, Spanish Harlem, Brooklyn, and you have, Little China. And you have all of the portions of the city that are under the same governance, the city of New York, right? is that really though? I mean, if you were to ask yourself honestly, if you were to honestly assess the city of New York, is it truly a melting pot, the way in which this idea that we think about, right? It really is a kumbaya. We all hold hands and celebrate differences. When we think about diversity, and I think that's a word we'll certainly explore, what comes to your mind when you first hear the word diversity, John?
Well, I think of it as, rather than what you just mentioned, New York City, and that is true that they have their separate boroughs, and so they're still separate. Whereas diversity, I think of truly is that you have a diverse amount of people working together, living together, not separated. Like that New York City quote, melting pot. You had the people, the Irish would move in and they'd go right to live in the Irish neighborhood. You know, Italians would live in the Italian neighborhood, whereas diversity is more.
Yeah.
Living together or working together.
Yeah.
Different ethnicities.
Yeah. Mungia's.
Josh, when I was in junior high, my English teacher, who was white, frequently brought up the idea that we as a country were a melting pot, and she said it proudly. That's what made us such a great country, that we were comprised of so many different races. And this was way back when I was in junior high. So it's interesting that this is being brought up again.
Yeah, Rudy.
Thinking of New York, some of the videos that were taken way back when the immigrants were still coming in, often the vision of the immigrants coming in by boat or whatever had a background of the Statue of Liberty. And on the Statue of Liberty, I think, I've never read it personally, but I understand that there is a plaque inviting a welcoming, with welcoming words about give me your poor, give me your those that are
Tired,
needy,
you're hungry,
and
yearning
so
to be
a
free.
welcoming. So that kind of blends in with a melting pot idea of come and you will be welcome.
Yeah. Yeah,
I
John.
I was thinking about what Emily said about melting pot versus salad bowl, and this may be like, you know, looking back at the past with rose-colored glasses or whatever, but it seems like in the olden days, right, when immigrants came in, that they often sought to abandon their heritage a little bit and fit in. So you hear all the stories about, you know, there might be a grandmother that lived in the house that spoke the old language, but by and large, the people wanted their kids to go to school, learn English, you know, learn the American, you know, fit in and be American, and that would lend itself to the melting pot idea. But now it seems like folks are coming in
I'm not the only persons at home.
want to retain their identity, you know, that makes it diverse or whatever, which lends itself more to like the salad bowl idea. I mean, you can all come together to be a great salad, but the tomatoes are still tomatoes and the arugula is still arugula.
Let me get, I saw Alex with his hand up. Alex, Peanut Gallery. And we're not seeing chats, so you're just gonna have to, you know, say, I want to say something. Alex?
And sticking with the melting pot point, one of the reasons, you know, they can glorify a big city like New York is the diversity of, more than anything, the diversity of food options and how you can get food from any corner of the world in one city. And it's sort of a, I'm trying to think of the right term for it, but the audacity of us to say, you can celebrate your culture with food in a way that we can enjoy it when we want to, but don't, you know, once you're here, you know, be proud to be here. Don't be proud of where you came from anymore, unless it's St. Patrick's Day or Cinco de Mayo or Black History Month. There's a time and a place for you to celebrate your culture when we've given you, but other than that, you know, we'll take the food celebration, but the rest of it, you should be happy to be an American and not anything else.
Yeah, I think the way that John was saying is abandon the idea of melting pot is abandon nationality, abandon kind of your own culture in order that you might fit in to American culture, which is coded language for fitting into majority white, predominantly white culture, and this idea of being American. And to be very honest with you, the Christian church, the Christian Protestant church and the Catholic church have been on the forefront for hundreds of years of telling you how to be a good American, which is coded for how to be a good white American Christian. Emily, and then we're gonna step
I
on.
was just saying, I think some point of discussion at some point has to be the difference between an immigrant coming to this country by choice versus people who were brought here against their will.
Yeah,
That's a very different object to look at those two things in our culture and how those two went side by side in our history. So.
yeah, well, and identity plays a part of that as well. So even classmates that I had whose 400-year earlier legacy of their family 400 years earlier were stolen from their culture and brought here, right? That there's still a connection to the identity. Who am I, and where does my ancestry come from, and how do I connect back to that and honor that part of and reclaim part of that identity for purposes of honoring my family and ancestry. So if you look on page 4, she starts to look at this through stories and emotion. And that's kind of the way into for us as well. This is letter E on the top of page 4. She writes, when talking about race and racism, we need to tell these stories and sit with emotions they bring up for us. White people also need to hear the stories of others who have had experiences different from their own, different than their own. And that is, if I am holding abandon and fit in so that you can be an American mindset, that puts me more in that polarized defensive way, which for me begins to say, I'm not interested in hearing your story, or as Alex is saying, other than your food, right? I'm not interested in hearing all this other part because I'm over on this one side of the scale. And part of moving out and away from polarization and defensiveness is beginning to put ourselves in position to hear the stories of persons who aren't like me. Does that make sense? And to begin to understand the emotions of persons who are different from me. And so then she goes into the stories of Trayvon Martin and the Black Lives Matter, the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. And you have the book, or you will get the book. You can read about that yourselves. But part of what became, what I think she argues, and I would support, of why that moment in time began to be more polarizing is because what we wanted to do, or what many wanted to do, is to support a law enforcement professional who felt threatened by a young Black boy. And therefore, him being out after dark, and whatever the stories of that circumstance were, he's bad, law enforcement good. And she writes, Zimmerman had in his mind a story of assumptions about a young Black man wearing a hoodie sweatshirt. The story in his mind told him that this young man was someone to harm and to suspect. Please forgive my typos. And that interpretation brought on an aggressive encounter that ended up with a gunshot that killed Trayvon. And what happens is, as we are growing up and as we begin hearing all these stories from one perspective, especially the perspective that looks like me, those begin the file cabinet in our head when we begin to encounter a young Black man, because I've heard all these stories about young Black men in my head and have been told all these things about young Black men in my head. That's the recall. That's the file management system in my head, that when I see Trayvon Martin, I'm recalling, I'm pulling out of the file cabinet all these stories and assumptions about young Black men. And that then is what is leading me in this encounter versus getting to know or coming to know the story of Trayvon. Does that make sense? What happened in this as well is that it became a very polarizing encounter. All right, the story of Trayvon being killed is not one that is lost from those within the Black community. It's not an abnormal story for those within the Black community. And it being elevated, and on the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, she writes, in response to the Black Lives Matter movement phrase gaining support, some white people took offense and people began posted, all lives matter. These reactions missed the point. What the original writers were expressing is that Black lives matter too, as in also, because of how often they had seen Black people shot without repercussion for the shooter. The people who lifted up Black Lives Matter did so as a protest, as a cry against injustice they witnessed on a regular basis. And so she adds, if you as a white person were seeing this happen to people who look like you, people who look like your brother or sister, parent or child, how would these stories impact you emotionally? What would it feel like to have so many people who look like you killed by police and see court case after court case end up with no conviction for the officers? Would you be enraged? Would you be terrified? Again, going back to the commitments of presence, beginning to learn to love the questions themselves, beginning to ask, was there something here within the story, if I can do the work of beginning to think outside myself and the experience of others, and if there's something that's triggering me there, using that as a clue for insight. I can think of a few examples. I know that one example we often hear about is the scary Mexicans who come from Central America who are coming to rape and kill our kids. And the story that gets elevated time and time again, right, is the one of the MS-13 gang member who killed a pretty white girl, right? And so then we're adding those stories into the file cabinet, where we are taking what is a minority of the population and ascribing it to the whole. One that's very fresh, and I would have you think about, is over the last few weeks, and I don't follow closely to the story, but Gabby Petito and the missing white girl syndrome. So this is a young social media person who went missing, was found murdered, right? And all of the attention that has been garnered on that, starting back over decades, starting back with, you think about John Benet Ramsey out of Colorado, and all Elizabeth Smart, and all these stories that have happened over decades, where we elevate the fear that those are bad guys are out to get our young white girls, and we galvanize around that. And yet, can you name any of the young Black girls who have been kidnapped from our communities under similar circumstances at any point over the last 20 years, 30 years, 50 years? And so I found this website. It's called blackandmissingincorporated.com. And it is a website, and I encourage you to go take a look at it. How to be your own CSI, crime scene investigator. Collect your child's DNA is how-to guide is available at this location. It provides a do-it-yourself lesson that no family should ever have to learn, but unfortunately, Black, Latino, Native American, other marginalized people whose loved ones disappear in the United States, law enforcement, media help often comes too little too late. and again, thinking about a narrative and how especially the media can be so polarizing racially, and tapping into that file cabinet of fears that we have within us as well. And so part of what Helsel is trying to get us to do is to begin to interpret our emotions, to begin to ask questions about our processing, about the file cabinet that we keep in our brains, and how we are reacting when we hear these various different stories. What is it that's being triggered when we hear stories that are happening at the border, or stories that are happening in St. Louis, Missouri, or Seattle, Washington, or Portland, Maine? And why am I feeling that? Whenever emotion or reaction that you're having is grounded and rooted in something. So let's put on the investigative hat and say, why is that? Where are those emotions? Why do I have this perspective? Why is it that this is what I think of when a young Black man in a hoodie pops up or comes up in conversation, or I see him on a street? Does that make sense? This is the work that we're beginning to do. And she goes into it and talks about racial identity development theory. I'm not going to get into that today. That's a little bit about what I did on the board just now, the movement from polarization to adaptation. And she tells her story, the story of herself, as she begins to come to ask those questions of ourselves. John Seaman gave me a book recently, and it's called Robert E. Lee and Me. And if you haven't read it, it's going on my top 10 list, especially books I'd recommend. Robert E. Lee and Me. And the author is a West Point graduate and PhD history professor. He's not.
Yeah, he was a PhD. He was a history professor there, but he graduated from Washington.
That's right. He graduated from Washington. Excuse me, you're right. I'm glad that the West Point grad corrected me of that. But he was born and raised in Virginia, and he grew up raised, idolizing Robert E. Lee and supporting the South narrative. And what a fabulous book of him being able to begin doing this work, understanding the story in which he's living, interpreting his emotions, and begin challenging through the lens of beginning to place himself in the thought of others. Does that make sense? So again, fabulous book. For those of you who are in class, and for those of you who are in the Zoom land, I will email it to you because I languished and labored about whether or not to include it. And I've decided to include it after I emailed y'all this morning. But I included some of my story. If you turn the page and you look at the beginning of page 6, back in the summer of 2006 is when I began to do this work of beginning understanding what are my stories, how do I interpret race through the lens of my stories, what has been formative for me. I give this to you as an example. This is, again, the summer of 2006. I'm beginning seminary. This is a journal I kept over 2 weeks, or these are excerpts from a journal I kept over 2 weeks, unedited. I did not edit them for distribution today. This is very vulnerable of me, but what I'm hoping this will do is not that I'm showing, what a great person I am, but showing the raw thoughtfulness that I was beginning, and the questions and the emotions that I were feeling as I was going through them. In particular, on page 8, I began to write about the high school that I went. And Kitty and I went to the same high school, and the high school was Tascosa High School in Amarillo, Texas. And our mascot was Johnny Rebel. And our flag for the school was the Confederate flag until the mid 80s. And when I attended school there at the beginning of the 90s, there was still a lot of backlash from folks who wanted it to be the Johnny Rebel Confederate flag waving school. And so I write about that there, and I write about my desire to wear and show my Confederate flag within the culture that I was, and the problems that existed. Early 90s, you have Rodney King, you have the beginning of Malcolm X being elevated and claimed, and all the racial tension that was happening related to that. So I include this for y'all simply to give you an idea of it's whatever, as you're beginning this work, what are the stories that have been formative and begun to shape how you think about race? What are the emotions that come up for you when we begin thinking about race, or when we hear stories on the TV, or when we see someone on the corner or walking down the street that is different from our own skin? And begin cataloging these. What's being pulled out of the file cabinet of our brain when that topic comes up? How am I being led by fear as a way that begins to make me defensive or polarized? In what ways might I be participating in minimalization? And so the question for us today, and I want to give us some time to do this, is what feelings emerge when you hear the topic of race raised? Do you feel nervous or frustrated, irritated or angry? Do you feel sadness or guilt? Where do these feelings come from, and where do you experience them in your body? And so that's our question for us to share now. I think I had that question in the handout as well. That is G, I think it is. What feelings emerge when you hear the topic of race raised, and how are you feeling? Cricket.
I have very mixed emotions because I'm very pro for interrelations, for people to interact and get along together. But I also have very much pride in my history past, like you. So I have a deep history of prejudices against me because of my relationship with Hispanics or Blacks, and not getting a job because of dating a Black, and et cetera, et cetera. But then when I hear stories about wanting to tear down history from the South, that bothers me also, because I feel like, okay, what they did was wrong. That's not right. But yet, how do I tear down their history? They don't want us to tear their history. So I think it's going to be really hard, and we have to learn a way to respect everyone's history, to come together, that we're not so busy trying to tear down each other's history. And I think we're also on the defensive. You know, it's like, I'm quick to say too, I'm not the one that brought you over as slaves. Don't blame me. And as a younger person, that was one of my mantras. Look, you know, you got to get on. You got to forget it. You've got to move on. And I think part of our problem is that we rehash. We never solve anything. So I think that the main part is that you have to reach people in their heart. You have to reach people, and they have to become better acquainted with other nationalities. I think, no, I grew up with the story of the melting pot, and I think that's true. I think, but the melting pot, when it first initiated, it was they secluded themselves, and it was all because of language, because they could not understand one another, so they started their own little, and that's where that began. But instead of that never coming together, it just got worse and worse and worse. And I don't know what the answer is. That's why I'm here today, is that I have lived a life of trying and advocating for minorities. I have been criticized. I have lost promotions because of my interacting with them when there was a time that, you remember this, Gloria and y'all, that, you know, I went to high school It was 90% Hispanic, and you could not speak Spanish in school. If you did, you were expelled from the school. And I lived in El Paso, Texas, which was on a border. So, you know, we've come a long way since then. That is totally different. You hear multiple languages in a school now, which is great. But because of that, because the multiple languages don't understand each other, then that's where the groups start up. That's where the groups, because, and part of it is lack of understanding of one another. So my question is, how do you pull all of these nationalities in? How do you get them to understand one another so that they respect one another and they're not quick to criticize and put down? And they have to realize that no nationality or race is perfect. And I think we're real quick to yell, oh, excuse me, the Mexicans did it, or they did it, you know, when it's not. It's society that has done it. It's us, our own insecurities and our own anger and our own frustration. And I don't know. I hope you can find an answer. I truly do.
Cricket, thank you for sharing. I appreciate your vulnerability. And I think that's the spirit for which we're beginning to explore. And you certainly, even for yourself, have elevated emotions and questions that could be clues for yourself to dig in and to do some, you know, examination from your own story and where that is. And that perhaps in that work, that God will be at work within you and helping to begin revealing some of those answers. Thank you for that. I hear you, and thank you. Rudy?
Yeah, well, kind of piggybacking on what Cricket is saying, a lot of that I feel has to do with education. Sadly, the current situation has politicized the teaching of history now in public schools, to where there cannot be any criticism of having to do with race. And so that is taken away from a better understanding. It's taken away from the culture, because in many minorities have participated in making the USA strong and what most people think of the USA today, but there is very little mention in history, or there has in the past. There's been very little mention in public schools history, and with the current political situation, that seems to be even getting pressed down even more. That there was no minority participation in history. It was all doings of the Davy Crockett's, et cetera, et cetera. So, so I think, like in a discussion like we're having now, it would be, you know, what can you say about that? Well, my feeling is to listen and to try to be tolerant, and that, you know, waiting for the next page to turn, and maybe history will become a little bit more inclusive for everyone.
Thank you, Rudy. Thank you for sharing. And I hear you. And one takeaway I feel like I hear from you is when you said the word, bye, Carol.
I'm sorry.
I know, go. Is education, right? And I think that's what I would write in my journal today. Is not what I wrote in 2006. In 2006, in my journal, I found this word, this line in there. I said, why do we keep talking about the 60s? And well, I hadn't done the work of the historical study and taking in information. And so I think there is some of that that's required as well. If I'm feeling a certain way when it comes to the topic of race, and maybe I ought to also spend some time taking in some education and some history to help do some balance of that. And again, this book, Robert E. Lee and Me, is a great example of that, of this person working through those challenges, the things that he was engaging through the intake of, and through education of historical information. Was there anybody in the Zoom land that wants to share? No, anybody else in here?
I've said enough.
Yeah, Emily.
You touched on it at the beginning. The author said that we need to be responsible for our own learning and education about this subject that we've been able to avoid. But I think that's what's helped me recently is the things that I've now read that have put history in a different perspective. And I just wish that I was in a position that you could have certain books read and discussed in our history, but like Isabel Wilkerson's book, Cast. If I were an AP history teacher, that would be required reading for me and my kids. But, you know, I'd probably be fired on the spot.
I don't know the book. What's it called?
Cast,
Oh.
C-A-S-T-E, by Isabel Wilkerson. And it really tries to point out how history has been taught and told and what the other things are to go along with it. And I just think that if we educate ourselves, then we can start in our little groups. I mean, I'm in several book clubs and we're reading, we're talking about these things. And at 75, our perspectives are changing. So that's good.
Well,
There's
thank you. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. And what my invitation is to all of us. It's coming to me, camera. What my invitation is to all of us, beginning this week, today, is to begin thinking about, I want to encourage us to think inwardly. We do take in information and by and large, we're a fairly educated group, even if that education was co-opted by agendas, we're still a fairly educated group. And that's great. What I want to encourage us is to dive in a little more inward and thinking about stories from our past of when we began to experience racism, learn about racism, what emotions begin to come up and that we would feel when those topics come to the forefront, when we hear them on the radio or the news. I know that I still have a lot of work to do. I'm still working on my stuff. I probably I took the racial identity development. I took an assessment in February this year, and that became my vocational goal as a pastor, as your pastor for this year, because on that assessment, what came back was that I found myself more in minimalization than I did in acceptance. And that surprised me because I thought I was further along than what the report showed me. And what we end up with is perceived, your perceived orientation versus actual. Right? So, and that's not good or bad. It just is what it is, right? We have how we an orientation about race and topics of how we perceive ourselves, which for myself, how I perceive, I put myself further down the scale, right? But under actual, I wasn't as far down the scale. And so there is always a gap between these two, where you perceive yourself and where you actually are. And the goal is to begin shrinking the gap. And in the work of doing that, we will find ourselves surprised, maybe frustrated, I know that that was, and this assessment was a growth moment for me because my perception didn't meet with reality. And I said, okay, well, I need to investigate a little bit further about why that is. And some of the things that I began to learn about myself is I just look at the neighborhood in which I live in. And I look at the church that I attend, and I look at my circle, social circles that I am in, and begin to realize that, and the way I schedule my calendar, and I begin to realize that I'm not in places of multiple experiences. I don't put myself in places of multiple experiences, and my head knowledge and perceived knowledge and academic knowledge and heart knowledge is one thing. But I still have some areas of growth, and part of my work is to investigate that and to pursue it, so that I can shrink that gap between perceived and actual. Does that make sense? And I think that's some of the work that we're going to try to enlist here in this class. Thank you for this. Again, I remind you, and I want to encourage you to consider journaling. Journaling isn't for everybody. I'm not a journaler, but maybe for a short period of time, you can think about writing some things down, because my going back and finding this journal of myself from 15 years ago is just something I pulled out this week. I haven't read that in 16 years or however long it's been, since 2006. It's 15 years. I haven't read that in 15 years. And so that was insight into me, as in these were the things I was saying back then. This is how I write it differently today. So I do want to encourage you to consider taking a moment and begin doing some journaling just to get some things on paper. And if it's easier for you to again, go to hopeaustin.org/anxious and just send it anonymously, you're welcome to do that. Again, there's no pressure on you whatsoever. Next week, we'll have a special guest presenter, Piper Betts Madison. We'll do our next chapter. If you are just getting the book, and Gloria, I've got your book right here. I'll leave it in the office. I want to get you to read up through the end of the 3rd chapter. Next week is on the chapter, I think it's called Feeling White. Through chapter 3, which is called Feeling White. And if you're using the 2nd edition, that includes the 2nd chapter, which she added here, but not in the 1st edition. So read through chapter 3. Piper Betts Madison is going to facilitate the class on Feeling White next week. And let us hold each other in prayer as we go. There's a closing prayer on the handout. Would someone feel courageous enough to either use that prayer or one of your own to close our time together? Diane?
Gracious God, our sins are too heavy to carry, too real to hide, too deep to undo. Forgive what our lips tremble to name, what our hearts can no longer bear, and what has become for us a consuming fire of judgment. Set us free from a past we cannot change. Open to us a future in which we can be changed, and grant us grace to grow more and more in your likeness and image through Jesus Christ, the light of the world. Amen.
Amen. God's peace be with you. C'est la vie. Hasta luego.